Okay, welcome to Voice of San Diego at Home. It's Voice of San Diego at Home. We've been doing this several months now, and I guess we're just going to be doing at home for a long time. You seem to be liking it, and we're having a lot of fun. We've got a lot of news to go through, and a great interview scheduled here with Cory Briggs. He's running for city attorney. He's been involved in local public affairs for a long time, and has quite a few things to say about the current city attorney, why he should be that, and criminal justice and other issues that we're going to go through. It is July 1st, 2020. We have now passed the halfway mark of the year. I cannot believe it. It makes me feel a little bit better on the idea of if this pandemic, all this stuff lasts a year or two, we'll be able to go through it fast because things are going fast. But on the other hand, feels like a year almost lost in a way. But in other perspectives, we are, and other people are more relevant and more interesting than ever. So maybe we'll look back at this time fondly. All right, we've got a lot to go through. This is let's talk first of all about the governor's big news today. Governor Gavin Newsom has announced that basically if you can't do it indoors, you can't do it in 20 counties across the state. He's closing zoos, card rooms, at least indoor activities for restaurants all across the state, but not San Diego. He left San Diego County out of that. Fascinating development with that. San Diego County is doing pretty well, I guess, compared to some of the hot spots, but there are some rather worrisome trends. Let's look at a couple of those really quickly. So this is the shot we've been, the triggers dashboard we've been following for some time. This is the triggers we're watching. There's only one trigger triggered right now, and that's the number 2, community outbreaks. We're only supposed to have 7 over a 7-day period. We've now seen 10. They detailed as much as they have so far where those outbreaks have occurred. They have been in mostly restaurants and private residences and bars, and that's why they say they are targeting restaurants or bars itself with some of the recent closures and curfews. So we'll see if that sticks. These other places in the state, from Imperial County to LA to Sacramento, have lost the opportunity to do anything inside with those restaurants, bars, and card rooms and other things like that. So fascinating development. But I also wanted to show you this. This is the one thing I've been worried about in our region. Let's zoom in a little bit. This is the daily hospital bed census. It is particularly what I have been watching is this this right here. These are the growth in hospitalizations in the county of San Diego related to COVID. So if you can see, we are talking about, I'll get better at this. Look at the production values of Voice of San Diego at Home. But check that out. So look at 493 yesterday, hospitalizations for COVID, 458 the day before, 427, 410. It is an unmistakable trend in the bad direction for hospitalizations in the county related to COVID-19. And I got to say, I got a personal stake in this. A friend of mine is now one of these people and in the hospital trying to deal with some symptoms that have gotten worse and worse with COVID-19 and worried about him. Look, a lot of people focus on the deaths. Oh, there's only so many deaths that happen with this disease. Only a few of them were really about, people with no underlying conditions. Well, look, a lot of people, A, have underlying conditions, and B, going to the ICU or going to the hospital for 3 weeks is not an ideal outcome for anybody's life. And there are more consequences to this virus than just the potential of death. So if you have loved ones or know of other people in the hospital these days, we're with you and worried about it with you too. And I'm worried about my friend as well. Go, Kev. Hope you're okay. All right. Next up, I wanted to talk about a story that was on our site today. And that is this one about students in San Diego County. We did an analysis about the disparities between how many of them, based on different backgrounds and racial aspects, are being suspended in school districts across San Diego County. No other racial group, this is reporting by Will Huntsberry, our education investigative reporter He said, no other racial group is so disproportionately suspended as Black students. Only one even comes close. Across San Diego County's 42 school districts, Black students represent less than 5%, and yet they represent more than 12% of the overall suspensions. We talked to a San Diego state researcher who believes a lot of this is based on profiling and based on increased surveillance and other things. It's pretty interesting revelation. You can see it at voiceofsandiego.org. That's voiceofsandiego.org. Check out his piece on that. Will Huntsberry did that. There was a administrator quoted who said, we're painfully aware of it. It's something we're trying to be more intentional about. Well, I hope that works out. Obviously, there's a lot of considerations with these, but there's a school to prison pipeline that a lot of people talk about. When you get in trouble as a youth, you lose progress in your education. You find yourself considering yourself as somebody who doesn't deserve the same opportunities or won't have the same opportunities, and you resort to different options. And the criminal justice system is right there waiting for you. All right, another interesting update. You might remember back in the olden days, March 3rd, we voted on the Convention Center tax Measure C. This was an increase to the hotel room tax in the city of San Diego. It would have funded homeless services and road repair. Would have been a pretty substantial increase to the hotel room tax in the downtown area, a little bit less around that, and then a little bit less even further out. It was put up as a ballot measure, though, because of the legal theory that as citizens' initiatives, as opposed to a measure that the city council put on the ballot, it could be considered law if it just got a simple majority support from voters. In other words, there's two ways to put things on a ballot. The city council can put something on the ballot, and citizens can put something on the ballot. And this ruling that we heard several years ago from the state Supreme Court was that if citizens put something on the ballot, then it was not part of the same California Constitution section that says that they need 2/3 of a vote for approval of a tax. In other words, you could pass a tax if citizens put it on there with only a slight majority. Sorry, I got kids bouncing around. With only a slight majority of the voters' approval. We've reported on this a lot, including right after the vote when supporters said they'd just have to wait a bit to see how some legal court cases panned out. Well, one of those cases did pan out, and that is the State Court of Appeal ruled Tuesday that a San Francisco initiative that similarly came up short of a full 2/3 vote actually passed. The case will probably go to the California Supreme Court, but it was the Supreme Court that opened this door in the first place when it ruled that the state constitution section that requires 2/3 threshold for tax increases does not apply to citizens' initiatives. All that said, that zombie tax measure that had millions of lives so far is back alive, maybe. We will see what happens with the California Supreme Court. But that brings us to our guest today, Cory Briggs. Hello, Cory. You were one of those, I think, who identified this, I wouldn't call it loophole in the law, but this theory that if you did a citizens initiative and that citizens initiative said we should raise taxes, it may not fall into that same California constitutional provision that says that it needs 2/3. It's sort of a separate part of that same section. What do you think? Do you think that this Measure C that got March 3rd, got 65% or so of the vote, do you think it has a chance to actually become law?
No.
Why is that?
You're right about the legal analysis. We did say that back in 2015 and 2016 when we were doing Measure D. But the Measure C that we just voted down had a bond provision in it, and bonds require a 2/3 vote, and it didn't get 2/3. And that 2/3 provision is outside of the initiative language that is at issue in the appellate case you're talking about a few moments ago. So you can't get around the 2/3 requirement.
Got it. Well, let's dive in. So we've got a lot of things to speak about. I think first of all, I'd like to get your take on the virus. It's affected our lives a lot. There's kind of many different camps of people who are dealing with it. Some people say government has overreacted. Other people say that we haven't contained it enough. And I think that's evidenced by the fact that we can't travel to Mexico, we can't travel to Canada, we can't travel to the European Union right now. Something's obviously wrong. What's your take on how government has handled this, and local authorities as well? Are we on the right track?
Well, I don't know whether we're on the right track because I don't do the science. That's above my pay grade. I think San Diegans, for the most part, have done a pretty good job. There are some folks who haven't followed the recommendations. I realize it's difficult for the folks in charge to impose mandates as opposed to strongly making recommendations. I think that the public needs to collectively evaluate the science. We need to take precautions. If it means we need to stay in a little bit, we stay in. Obviously, you don't want the cure to be worse than the disease, but at the same time, we're still in the middle of it. We have to be safe, and I err on the side of caution, but I don't err on the side of telling people that you can't go for a walk, that you can't walk the dog, that you can't go for a jog. I think if you take precautions, you keep your distance, we're going to have to ride this out. But I listen to the folks who know a lot more about epidemiology and viruses than I do to lawyers and politicians on this one.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, so let's talk about some legal stuff then. I think you're best known not for being a politician, but for being somebody who often tangles with them in court or tangles with the people who work for them in court. I think you told the UT in January that you had sued the city 20 times. There may have been more since then. How many ongoing lawsuits do you have against the city of San Diego, and what are they about?
They run a range. Most of them have something to do either with open government, with not getting votes on raising money or incurring debt, or environmental issues.
Oops, sorry.
That's okay. We're all learning this technology, right?
Yeah, I was trying to follow how they do that. All right. Okay. Well, how many are there at now? Do you know, or
probably
countless?
Probably about 15.
Oh, okay. And I think one of the main questions that comes right up from that, though, is would you have to recuse yourself from many different parts of the law were you to become city attorney and have influence over some of these issues that you sued about?
Well, on the cases, I would have to recuse. I can't be a lawyer and flip sides. On the issues, if the issues are generic issues that come up, I don't have to recuse. I know something about it, and I give my best advice based on the information we have, and we go forward. But on the actual lawsuits, I'd have to recuse.
Mm-hmm. I was covering City Hall back in 2004 when we watched then candidate for city attorney and later city attorney Mike Geary. He really had a revolutionary effect on defining what the city attorney's role was. His view was that the city attorney was elected, and he pointed to flyers when that change was made in the 30s that said that the people were the city attorney's client. And in many cases, he found himself squaring off with members of the city council, accusing them of various levels of corruption. The mayor and other city staffers who he would tangle with, he very clearly saw his role not as accountable to them, the city council, the mayor, but as accountable to the people. And I think he also innovated he kind of realized like how powerful that role was. And even though the two city attorneys since him, Jan Goldsmith and Mara Elliott, have both run on the idea that they weren't going to be that way, they have both, to a certain extent, realized just how powerful that office is as a almost veto or definitely powerful place in City Hall. You can make things not happen or make things happen from that spot. And to various degrees, both her and Jan Goldsmith have done that. What do you see your role, were you to become city attorney? What do you see the role of the city attorney being in that sort of frame?
Well, so let's make sure your viewers know that the city attorney really has three jobs. One is to advise the mayor and the city council and the departments. Another one is to represent the city and city officials in court. And the third one is misdemeanor and infraction prosecutions. Those are really the three roles. I view the city attorney's position like this. The client is the city of San Diego. I am accountable to the voters. The voters will decide whether I do a good job or not, whether they reelect me. They are the ones who put me in office. I give advice to the mayor and the city council. They're the ones who have to make the decisions. I'm not the decision maker. So I put forward my best legal advice. I make sure the public knows about it because I want the public to know that I'm doing my best, and I want the public to know what information it is that the mayor and the city council have when they make their decisions. If the mayor and the city council make good decisions, they get credit for it. If I give good legal advice, I give credit for it. If they make bad decisions and I gave good legal advice, that's on them. But my motivation is to protect the city, to protect the taxpayers, to honor the will of the voters. They're the ones that I'm ultimately responsible to. And they are putting me in position to go work with the other team members, the team members being the mayor and the city council and the departments.
We're seeing a ballot measure move forward right now about that specific role. Like you said, they have the role of the misdemeanor enforcement, the prosecutions of misdemeanors. They have the role of advising the city council and of doing litigation such. But this ballot measure would strip the litigation and the advice from the elected city attorney and instead make it so the city attorney as an elected person was only responsible for prosecuting misdemeanors within the city of San Diego. Is that a ballot measure you support?
Well, this is a concept right now, right? The ballot measure hasn't actually been written. I'm going to do whatever the voters say. If the voters don't want to have an elected city attorney on the advisory and representation side, that's fine. I will be in there to help wrap it up and fulfill their will. If they decide that they want to have somebody in there who's independent, I will fulfill that will too. But I'm going to follow the will of the voters just like I do all the other times.
So, but surely you have a view about whether it should be an elected position or not.
Oh, look, if Mara Elliott were my attorney, I'd want a new attorney too. So I understand exactly why the city council, I mean, Republicans and Democrats, she's certainly united. She's bridged the partisan divide in that respect. I think the voters will decide whether they want to have a say over who is a legal advisor or not. I defer to them.
So just to be clear, you don't have any perspective on whether it should be an elected post or not.
No, I can see the arguments that go both ways. I understand that there are concerns about it being a politicized office. It clearly has been hyper politicized under Mara Elliott. It also hasn't given good legal advice to the mayor and the city council. They've gotten into a lot of problems that bear the city attorney's seal of approval. So if I were in their situation, I certainly would want somebody different. They don't get to go out and campaign for me. So their choice is to say, well, maybe we get rid of this person. I think the voters need to, we need to have that argument. Does it make sense if you're going to get rid of that role to have the city attorney continue to have criminal responsibility over misdemeanors and infractions? That's a huge chunk of the budget. Would people want that to go to the district attorney or stay in the city? I think you have to have all of those conversations, and we just don't know enough about it yet to have that meaningful conversation.
Okay. Well, let's move on. I wanted to focus on some topical such stuff for this period. Feels like we're dealing with three major crises right now. One is this public health crisis. The other is this economic crisis, people losing their jobs all across the region, all across the country. And then there's this third crises, the crisis about the trust in public institutions, including at the center of that right now is various law enforcement efforts across the country, whether it's ICE and Border Patrol or whether it's local public police officers within cities and states. You wrote an op-ed for the UT and you said, for too long, politicians have done their best to push wages down while union bosses counter with bad cop protections and promises that the union will endorse and spend money on politicians when they run for re-election. What you're saying there is that instead of giving them actual money, they exchanged that for, they said, well, we can't give you money. We'll just protect your worst actors. Is that what you're implying there?
Yeah, there's a trade-off. You get what you pay for. And if you're going to be insisting on pushing down wages, obviously the union's going to negotiate something in exchange. If you want the best police officers, you're going to have to pay for the best police officers. And when you do, it allows you to say, no, we're not going to keep the bad apples around and we're not going to protect them. But we've done this. It's this, we do this dance every few years. And that, look, that's symbolic of a lot of things that we do, right? The politicians, they get beaten up when they overpay. But right now, the public is getting to see the consequences of us not having nothing but the best on the street, right? If you allow a few bad apples out there, you have serious problems. And that's a consequence of the way this relationship has worked. The unions protect bad members. The politicians get to claim victory for a fair deal for the taxpayers, and then the unions turn around and support the incumbents. That's the way this game works, and we need to call it out. We need to acknowledge that that's the way it's been done for a long time, and then we need to say no more.
All right, it's a question for everyone out there. If you are interested in the city attorney's race or interested in just the future of the city of San Diego, this is an important person to talk to, one of the candidates for city attorney. What are your questions? And be free. If you don't know something and want to know, let us know. We can try to explain or find out who can explain later. What are your questions for how the city operates, how it should operate, how police unions, the city attorney operates? We would be glad to take those on. I want to hear from you. What are your questions for Cory Briggs? We are one of, not all cities have elected city attorneys. And so it's both a privilege and a responsibility for us to manage these discussions. So let's continue on that question. You've been pretty critical of the police union, the Police Officers Association in the city of San Diego. You've hammered Mara Elliott, the current city attorney, for getting their endorsement. And just to be clear, that's not something you wanted or sought at any point?
No.
And why? What is it about police unions that you don't want to associate with?
Well, I don't think that any public official should be out seeking endorsements from people who do business with the city. Mm-hmm. I just think that's fundamentally wrong. I also think that prosecutors, and the city attorney as part prosecutor, should be like judges and should be swearing off of the endorsements from the political players. Everybody needs to have confidence that the city's top law enforcement official, and that's what the city attorney is, that the top law enforcement official in the city is beholden to nobody except the public's interest and to the voters. And when you start taking these endorsements from people who are doing business with the city, who have inside tracks, who are special interests, people legitimately question whether your loyalties are to the public or to those special interests. I just swear off of it altogether. You mentioned you've been covering City Hall since 2004. You know that I've been there even since then. And my single biggest issue has always been, can the public trust what the government's doing? Are we turning square corners? Are we being fully transparent? Are we being completely honest? That has been a problem. That's not a new problem. It has been the motivating issue for me since moving back to San Diego in 2002. You and I have, our paths have crossed a number of times on issues of government being trustworthy or not. Most recently, I think, with the school district hitting the delete button on millions of emails. And I take a pretty firm, unforgiving stance on transparency and making sure that we follow the rules, because that's what separates us from places where most people don't want to live.
On this question of police, it just sometimes I hear things later and realize they were interesting. You said, we don't pay, we don't have the best police force because we don't pay enough. Are you actually saying that we should pay officers significantly more?
Yes, I think that that the officers that we hire should be able to afford to live in San Diego. They should be able to afford to raise their families and be part of the fabric of our communities. And we don't have that now. We have officers who are commuting an hour or more. That's not, what you hear politicians often say that we can police ourselves, right? Is in various contexts. Yeah, we should be policing ourselves, and our officers should be our neighbors. And we don't pay our officers enough to be our neighbors. When you want a good plumber, when you want someone to do some repairs or remodel at your house, and you see your neighbor had it, you walk across the street and say, "Hey, who did the work for you? Would you recommend them? They do a good job, yes or no?"
Mm-hmm.
I trust my neighbors, and so am I willing to pay more to have police officers as my neighbors? You bet I am.
You're saying, I think something that I can grok, which is the idea of like, look, we should have the finest people, but we should also have the finest oversight of them. We should be able to evaluate and remove them quickly if needed. One of the arguments against that historically in public employee situations is that a political actor, if given freedom to fire public officials, public employees, would use that inappropriately, and that thus public employees, teachers, police officers need to have intense protections against that, and that's why it's so hard to fire them. I mean, do you have a response to that?
Well, some of that's already written into the law for police officers. We have the Peace Officers Bill of Rights. What I'm talking about is the city's union contract that goes beyond that, right? At the city level, we can't change state law. That's above our pay grade. But we shouldn't be negotiating protections for bad officers. Yet we've done that in the contract right now, and we've repeated it over a dozen times since we did the contract about 5 years ago. So yeah, if you are going to be a public official, you're going to have to turn square corners. You're going to have to be completely transparent. You are held to a higher standard. It's a significant responsibility. It's a tough job, but we have to hold people to high standards. When we don't, we end up with problems, and we're seeing that now.
It's kind of the opposite of defund the police then. You want to fund them, but in exchange get some power.
Well, defunding the police, that's a somewhat different issue. I'm talking about having community policing. You can't have community policing if your police officers don't live in the community. It's just by definition. So we should make it so that our officers can live there. Now, I realize that the city recently created a program where officers can get a loan. Apparently, we've gotten some matching money to do that. That's all fine and good, but we should have been doing this for a long time. The point of the comment that you read from my op-ed is that for a long time we've been ignoring this, and it needs to be part of the normal way we do business. Our officers should come from our community. We should do everything we can to have San Diego officers, San Diego residents patrolling San Diego streets. What you ask the officers to do, that's the defund the police issue, and that's a separate question. But we should have San Diegans. They should be able to afford to live here, raise their families here, and be part of our community.
But you are on board with that sort of middle idea of the defund movement, which is I feel like, let me just add context. There's sort of two iterations of defund police. One of them says, start over, disband everything, and rebuild a community policing system or public safety system from the ground up. And then a second version says, we have added too many responsibilities to the police departments. It's making it so that they respond with weapons, firearms to situations that do not need to get that violent, and thus we should cut out all those situations, defund that, and fund some other response to those situations. I would gather from what you said, you're kind of on that latter camp.
Yeah, I think that's where San Diegans are. Right? San Diegans are a fair-minded bunch. They see what's going on in the protests. Nobody thinks that others should have to suffer an injustice that they aren't willing to suffer themselves. San Diegans are there. At the same time, San Diegans, in large part, are satisfied with the police department. There's room for improvement, but the majority of San Diegans are not in favor of getting rid of police and starting from scratch. So that's why in my op-ed I said we need to be asking the questions that we've not been asking for a long time, and that is, what do we expect of police officers? And there's plenty of room, whether you call it defunding or reprioritizing, reimagining, whatever it is. There's lots of opportunity, and perhaps we'll talk about it today or at other times. There's lots of opportunity to say, what is the best way of dealing with social problem X or Y or Z? What's the best way of approaching it? And is the best way to approach it sending women and men in blue to deal with it? That we need to ask those questions and get answers to them before you can say, well, this is how much we're going to take, or this is what we're going to do. You need to walk before you run.
Okay, let's let's take some questions from people. This is relevant. Gabby Dow says, "Can you discuss why the officers' names who dragged a woman into an unmarked minivan have not been released, but officers who shot a man this week were immediately identified?" It's like I think there's a constant criticism of the police department that there's transparency when it makes their case, but then there's not transparency when it doesn't help them. Is that a view you agree with?
In general, yes. Yeah. But look, that's not unique to the police department. Mm-hmm. That's unique. That's the same thing with the water department and the human resources department and the city attorney's office and the mayor's office. I mean, pick your office, right? That's when they're happy about it, they show you. When they don't like what you're going to see, they come up with excuses for not letting you see it.
This isn't quite the same area, but one of the things that your opponent, the incumbent city attorney, Mara Elliott, has gotten a lot of acclaim for across the country is this gun violence protection orders or restraining orders that she pulls. She says, if you've been accused of crime or domestic violence or otherwise are otherwise suspected of being a danger to the community, she can go and take your firearms. And she has she not only does it a lot here, but she has trained other officers and prosecutors across the state on how to do that. She's been held up for that. In the UT in January, you said she gets props on the gun violence restraining orders. You haven't heard me criticize any of that, but then a couple months later, you did criticize that. You said in an email to campaign supporters, her own data through last fall revealed that she obtained gun violence restraining orders against Black residents at a rate more than double their population representation. So the gun violence restraining orders are good, but not how she's carried them out?
Yeah, look, so she has done a fantastic job of promoting herself on this issue. And good for her. But I don't just care about the policy. I also care about the implementation. Just before you and I started talking today, you were talking about expelled students, right? Suspended students, right? And I wrote some notes here. I think you said 12% of the suspensions were Black students, if I heard you correctly, and that they were 6% of the population. Well, that's the same numbers we have in San Diego, and gun violence restraining orders are issued at 13 or 14% toward Black San Diegans. So I'm concerned the same way your article today raises a legitimate concern about whether there's bias in the suspensions. I'm concerned about bias in how gun violence restraining orders are being pursued. And the way you make sure that there is no bias is you have to be fully transparent and you have to be willing to do some self-reflection. So I don't know anybody who is advocating to have people who are mentally or emotionally unstable at a serious level from having firearms. I just don't know what constituency supports that. That's not the heavy lift. That's the easy lift. Everybody expects your prosecutor to be taking every opportunity under the law to keep guns out of hands of people who shouldn't have guns. That's a no-brainer. That's not the difficult part. The difficult part is making sure that you're doing it in a fair way, in an equitable way, that you're willing to be self-critical, that you're willing to hold a mirror up to your office, and that you want outside eyes looking in to make sure that you don't have a blind spot. We don't have that in the city attorney's office. So that's why I was critical of the implementation and the lack of oversight and the lack of self-reflection to make sure that we are not discriminating against Black San Diegans.
One more point on this criminal justice such stuff. You made a point in one of these emails that Mara Elliott keeps a secret, quote, Brady list, a list of officers known to falsify police reports and then lie in court, but she refuses to disclose it. If we want ethical and competent cops, we must equally insist on ethical and competent city attorney. She blasted that. She sent out her own letter. It was a little bit vague. It was hard for me to quite understand her point in it, in the sense, but what she was basically saying,
you weren't alone, Scott.
She was basically saying, we don't release that. What we do is provide it to defense attorneys when their clients are accused of something and the police officer's word is the accusation, is the heart of the accusation. So we disclose potential challenges with that officer's word, with their ability to be trusted when it's appropriate. And she said, quote, the Brady list protects the rights of the accused by ensuring that those records of misconduct are fully disclosed to defense attorneys. Why is that inadequate?
Well, for a number of reasons. First of all, the Brady list is different from Brady evidence. Brady evidence is what the Supreme Court says prosecutors must turn over to defense lawyers and to the accused if there's any exculpatory evidence, any evidence of bias or dishonesty by the police officers involved in the case. The list is the list that Mara Elliott compiles of officers that she knows are dishonest. They've been proven dishonest. That's separate from the Brady evidence that you give to a particular individual defendant. I can't think of why you would know that there's an honest officer who's out there collecting a paycheck and a pension, and you know the officer is dishonest, and you keep that secret because you know if you put that officer on the stand, you could lose your bar license. That's what this is about. If you put a dishonest officer on the stand knowingly, you know the officer's going to tell a lie, you know the officer's manipulated evidence, the lawyer loses the lawyer's license. If you protect those officers, you're essentially just trying to protect yourself. Those officers have no business being on the street. They have no business being on the public's payroll. So there shouldn't be a Brady list. If you know the officers are dishonest, you should take action to do something about it. The other reason her memo was disingenuous is because she can prosecute dishonest officers. It is a misdemeanor to falsify a police report. It is a misdemeanor to work with somebody to procure false evidence in a case. If those are the reasons why you have people on your Brady list, it's absolutely within your purview to do something about it. And yet she has done nothing. You can go look at the court records. We don't have any cases of the city attorney's office under Mara Elliott going after dishonest cops, yet she acknowledges she has the list. She even said in writing that it's better for the public not to know whose name is on the list. That's a problem. And the third point with the Brady evidence is that in California, it doesn't have to be turned over until shortly before trial. But most cases are resolved through a plea bargain, which means defendants are admitting to crimes, often lesser crimes, that get reduced so the prosecutors don't have to put on their case. They agree before they've seen the Brady evidence because Brady evidence doesn't have to be turned over until shortly before trial. So if you're cutting a deal because you're afraid of what's going to happen to you, and the prosecutor has not told you that there's exculpatory evidence, that's not right. And this whole idea of holding back, it reveals an attitude that the goal of prosecutors is to get convictions. That's not correct. The Supreme Court has said this many times. Other courts have said it many times. The prosecutor's job is unique. Unlike private lawyers whose job it is to get a good outcome for their clients, the prosecutor's lawyer is to achieve justice for the system, for the public. And sometimes that means not getting a conviction.
Mm-hmm.
So if your goal is just to get conviction numbers up, that's wrong. So I have a lot of problems with the Brady. There's one other issue, and that is when it's secret, you can have good cops put on it because they wouldn't politically support the prosecutor, right? They wouldn't endorse, they wouldn't cut a favor. And they get put on this list, and then they get blacklisted. They can't get promotions. They can't get other opportunities. That's not okay either, right? We need to celebrate the good officers, not put them on blacklist because they won't, yield to the will of the prosecutor in political things.
So you would publish the list right away?
I just wouldn't have a list.
Oh, okay.
There's the officers who are known to be dishonest need to be prosecuted, or they need to be moved on so that they cannot be in a position to harm people or harm the system. The good officers should not be on a list.
Got it. Let's switch topics before I run out of time with you. You had your own ballot measure, Measure D, several years ago about the future of Mission Valley. You'd hoped to help facilitate the transfer of the Mission Valley Stadium land that the city owns to SDSU or to another university in town. That failed, but you've remained interested in it. Let's see, it would have been late May, you wrote an op-ed in the Times of San Diego saying that basically Mara Elliott had been determined as city attorney to sink the transaction between San Diego State and the city. She had a number of concerns about various issues, from sewage to the park to other things that were going on. You said those were all pretty much garbage, I think, but the deal did get done. In that day that it was done, Don Theodora, the attorney with California State University System, said the university agreed to unprecedented broad indemnities, many more than is typical of a traditional real estate transaction. And John Kratzer from JMI, who worked with SDSU on those negotiations, said, "We believe we have far exceeded our offer of October last year. It goes well beyond the requirements of Measure G." I think it would be fair to say that Mara Elliott is part of the reason why they got more out of that, more indemnities, more from the transaction. And yet you would have, I think, taken it much earlier a deal. Why?
Well, remember, Mara Elliott is the one, and I think your outlet is the one that reported it. Mara Elliott insisted that the negotiations be confidential more than a year earlier, except the deal was already decided by the voters. Everybody knew what was in Measure G. So there was nothing to be gained by being confidential. There was already an appraisal. Everything was there to be seen. There was no advantage for doing things in secret. She's been opposed to this from the beginning. Remember, she's the one who went in secretly to get permission to sue the voters to keep this off the ballot. That was a frivolous lawsuit, wasted $600,000 paying Soccer City's lawyers. Full disclosure, I was reimbursed about $500 because I was one of the lawyers to make sure that the voters had a chance to weigh in on both. She's been opposed to it from the beginning. She had a chance to raise all of these issues early on. None of what she raised is new. SDSU agreed to it because they're just ready to do the deal. But the question is, why did we wait a year and a half? Why did this stuff come out at the last minute? Why all the high drama? And if it could have been done, if it was so easy and not a big deal, we should have done it earlier and saved the $15 or $20 million in costs that the city incurs to have that site essentially on mothballs. We could have done this much earlier. So yeah, I'm critical of it. And when at the end the justification had to be protecting pure water, I mean, Scott, don't you find it interesting that all of this was done to protect something that nobody at City Hall believes is going to happen until 2040? Let's say, right, the second phase of pure water, which is what she said she was protecting. None of this is going to happen for decades, if at all. Why is that? Why was that the reason? I'm
Well,
not.
I mean, like, I think if we had her on, and I did have her on, she would say, well, look, they do imagine that needing that land, that aquifer is special. It was part of the water department's assets because it is a place of interest for the water system. And they have imagined, I do understand to some degree that it's suspicious about how much they may rely on that land in the future or plan to rely on that land, but they wanted to protect their access to it and some of the groundwater measuring wells and all that. Was that just completely illegitimate? I mean, why not let them hash that out? What's the problem with that discussion?
Well, the issue wasn't whether San Diego State was going to allow people to have access to wells and monitor groundwater. That wasn't the fight. The fight is whether the site would be available for the second phase of pure water. The injection on the site, that was looked at 5 or 6 years ago and was dismissed as one of the worst options under pure water altogether. It's not a good site that's suitable for that. And, you should, go do what your organization is known for doing really well. Go read the documents and you'll see that, the pure water plan would have run south of the San Diego River, right, which is south of the site. So if the infrastructure by the city's own recent documents is going to run south of the site, why all the high drama at the last minute to protect the site? I'm sort of bemused by the spectacle.
So is your interpretation that she tried to kill it and failed and this was all a show?
My interpretation is that she's not very good at doing transactions for the city. You have the 101 Ash deal that has her seal of approval on it. That was a disaster. The city attorney should have never let it happen. You have the secret streetlight transaction, has her approval on it. That should have never happened. You have no bid contracts on things like tracking short-term vacation rentals. That's one of the reasons the city auditor wants independent lawyer, because the city attorney's office screwed that up and then couldn't give advice to the auditor. She has no track record of success. And when she screws up, there's no malpractice insurance to go after when you are a city lawyer. So she has no skin in the game, but she's in a re-election campaign. She needed to do something on a big transaction to get some plaudits. And she came up with something because, folks haven't read the pure water documentation like some of us have. They didn't know that she was just making something up. Why do you think SDSU had no problem agreeing to everything? Because it wasn't really giving anything up. Right? They were happy to do it. So if they were willing to do it, why couldn't we have done this much earlier?
Fair enough. All right. Before I let you go, let's get a couple of things in. One of the recurring criticisms that you face is that you've sued so many developers and agencies and such on behalf of clients who are often hard to identify. It's often hard to find them. You sometimes refuse to disclose them. You faced criticism even from judges and sanctions. Do you have a response to that? Is there sort of an overarching way to explain that sort of constant thing that's dogged you as a public interest lawyer?
There's two ways to explain it. Every time I represent an organization, when we go into court, some member of the organization has to identify himself or herself. So it's simply false to say that my clients are not known to the courts. This issue has been litigated in court several times. Every time the judges say, yes, these are the people, we agree with Mr. Briggs's clients. Because it's salacious to write a story that Briggs doesn't have clients, that's the part that gets published. Nobody publishes the follow-up that says, no, the judge said everything was legit. The other part of it is, that whole story came up several years ago. It was part of a smear campaign I've responded to it and explained why it was not true. It's been investigated by the state bar. The state bar has more than once given me a clean bill of health. But it's just something that folks who don't want an outsider in the city attorney's office like to drum up and throw out. Comes with the territory. That's fine, but
have you
untrue.
ever created a client to represent as opposed to a client's come to you to represent?
No.
Okay. On some of the community questions that came in, one of them was, will you fully respect and efficiently carry out the wishes in letter and spirit of the voters on the midway height limit ballot measure? This came in also from one of our commenters here. Any comments on the midway district and the RFPs going forward? So just some background. The sports arena land falls west of the 5. Almost 50 years ago, voters decided that city land west of the 5 should have a 30-foot height limit on construction, which means if you wanted to rebuild a sports arena on that same plot, you couldn't, because the sports arena is 60 feet. You would need to get an exemption, you need to get a vote of the people. SeaWorld did that in the late 90s. They got an exemption. They ended up building those roller coasters that are there. Now, City Councilman Jen Campbell and City Councilwoman Jen Campbell and City Councilwoman Councilman Chris Cate have put forward a ballot measure to ask voters once again to allow an exemption, this time for that whole sports arena land, to go above 30 feet for construction. What's your take on that? Will you respect that? Are you opposed to that?
No, do whatever the voters say.
Fully and in letter and spirit, as the questioner asked?
And there's no other way to do it. You
Okay.
follow the letter of the law, the spirit of the law. I have not seen the proposal myself. I understand that it's a concept at the moment. It still needs to be drafted, go to the city council for final ballot language. I'm assuming everybody will follow the rules, and it'll be a straight up vote on whether the public wants to raise the height limit in that part of town. The voters approve it. That's the law of the city, and that's what we're going to do.
All right. One other question that came in was, are you a Democrat?
I am a registered Democrat.
Do you identify as part of the party?
No.
Why?
I registered. I was a Democrat many, many years ago, and probably 15 or 20 years ago, I became an independent because I don't like the party politics. I think that the people who run parties are more interested in power than governing. I had that reinforced during the Bob Filner era. I supported Bob, and then unfortunately, I think most folks know what happened. And I was fairly disgusted at the way the party handled that. And so, I don't consider myself part of the party. I did switch from independent to Democrat last year when I decided to run for city attorney, because I think the public is entitled to know where my values lie, and I identify more with the Democrats in terms of values than the Republican Party. But I don't. I'm certainly not one of the party favorites, one of the party operatives. I don't have high praise for the party leadership. I want to see the public respected. I want to see the public taken care of. I want to see the public put first. And so that's the answer.
Yeah, I think just some refresher on that. It's amazing how much you remember when things are brought up like that. So yes, when we're talking about Bob Filner was mayor, you were actually the first prominent person to ask him to resign or demand that he resign.
And you were the person who called me and asked me whether I'd faxed him a letter to that effect. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
And I remember the circumstances. It wasn't just, we were still to learn about all the accusations women had brought against him. This was your concern was primarily about, at that moment, some of the things we had heard about that he was doing to, the word extort is hard, but really push developers who were building things in the city of San Diego to go beyond what they had already agreed to mitigate with the city and actually, support some pet projects of his own. And you felt like that had crossed the line. I think there was something interesting in that, because you are part of a world that really pushes developers to conform to law. You sue them, you do all these things to get benefits for the community or for your clients out of it. And you felt like that was almost like a corruption of that whole system. Is that fair?
Yeah, look, the process is sometimes messy, and it's far from perfect, and we all need to do our best to make the process better. But at the end of the day, no matter who you are, if you've done what the government has required of you and you're following the rules, it's improper for any public official to try to strong arm you and to threaten you and to deny you of your rights. I'm not on too many developers' Christmas lists or Hanukkah lists or Kwanzaa lists. You pick the list. I'm not on them for developers. But it didn't matter, because right is right. And shaking down developers and holding up their projects to get donations for this cause, or to try to extract concessions after they had done everything they were asked to do. Look, it's the golden rule. That wouldn't be okay if they did it to Scott Lewis. It wouldn't be okay if they did it to Janet Smith. And it's not okay just because it's a developer.
Well, Cory Briggs, you're running for city attorney. Is there any last thing you would want to tell the voters about why and what you would keep in mind if you got elected?
Yes, I think you should make sure your audience understands that we're gonna be a fully transparent city attorney's office. Unless the law requires that something be kept confidential, the public will be entitled to see it. We're going to put out all of our advice publicly in advance, and we welcome the scrutiny and the feedback. We will start, the city attorney really is the gatekeeper of bad behavior. That's what, if you read what the voters did when they created the elected city attorney position, they wanted a gatekeeper for bad behavior. They wanted somebody who's just going to make sure we keep the bad stuff out of City Hall. We don't have that right now, and the public deserves it, right? The good cops deserve it. Black San Diegans deserve it. Everybody deserves it. Pick your issue. Everybody deserves to have an effective, transparent, accountable gatekeeper against the bad behavior, who's willing to make the tough calls and take the criticism when that happens. And I won't duck that.
Cory Briggs, thanks for taking the time.
Thanks, Scott.
We'll probably bring you on again before this all gets resolved. I appreciate you coming on.
I look forward to it. Thanks very much.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Well, that was Cory Briggs. Interviewing is hard. If you have any other questions that we should have got to him, I can always ask him more, and I'm sure there's more follow-up to be done. I found his comment on the appointed city attorney question very interesting. He clearly doesn't want to take a public stand on which side San Diegans should go on whether they should vote or not for the city attorney's role. All right, let's do one quick thing we've been doing here and there, just a tour of what's to be seen on Voice of San Diego today. So check this out. So this is the site today. We are featuring that story about suspensions in San Diego and the disproportionate impact that they have often on Black students in particular. Also, Jesse Marks this week revealed that police tapped into those smart streetlights that they have to surveil to see if they could find evidence of some of the people who had thrown bottles at police, damaged their cars, and other issues, looting that they wanted to find. Remember, those smart streetlights were put up on the sort of proposition that they could be used to do things like check out pollution and make things safer. It was never discussed until they were actually implemented that they would be used for police, but police seem to be the only ones who are making use of those smart streetlights. Jesse Marks has been on that for some time. Also, Marks broke the story that the Border Patrol, even though cannabis is legal in San Diego and in California, the Border Patrol is seizing legal cannabis that's being transported between Imperial County and San Diego. Fascinating dissonance between the state law and the the country's laws. Obviously, it's still a felony narcotic in the United States, but it's legal and even considered essential in California. Sign up for the morning report. Highly recommend today's morning report. We had a lot of discussions in there. The student suspension, also the summary of that legal ruling that may keep the convention center tax effort alive. Also, what is an outbreak? There are a lot of things going on with outbreaks and with the county public health issues. So check out the morning report if you are so inclined to follow those things. And back to this is the hospitalization totals in San Diego. Oops, you don't need to see my emails. This is the number we're watching. I'm very nervous about that. Just a little over a week ago, there were 330 people in hospitals with COVID-19, and now that is up to 493, and it looks to be rising. And one of them is my friend, and I hope that he is okay over time. Thank you so much for joining today, and stay tuned for Friday. We'll have another guest and another Voice of San Diego member, and I very much appreciate everybody who's involved with these Voice of San Diego at Homes, and a special shout out to Megan Wood, who helps make this possible every day. She's my bro. We get a lot done together. Love Megan and love the product team she's a part of. Thank you all, and we'll talk to you soon.